The following program is a videotape production of the Maine Public Broadcasting Network.
You know, when the snow gets real deep around here, sometimes the only excitement you have is standing around watching the flies dying on the windowsills. But every once in a while, somebody like Don Taverner will stop in for a visit. Don was out of state quite a long time there, quite a few years. But he's back now, and he stopped in the other night, and I guess he's glad he is back.
Oh, goodness, Kendall, I've been from coast to coast and border to border, and too many times at that. I'm glad to be home again and to be in Maine where I really belong, I guess. But I do get around Maine some and seeing old friends and places that I didn't see for so long, and I got up in Rustic. I don't know if you've been up there at all lately.
Not lately, no.
Well, it's changed since I left there almost 50 years ago. As a boy, the town of Ashland is where I was born, and that town has really become quite a lot sophisticated. It never was a frontier town in my time, but it's a lot more sophisticated now than it was. And of course, I spent a good many years down in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
In fact, when I decided I wanted to come home, that's where I was located in Washington, and I thought, gee, I'd like to get back to Maine. If I could find something to do back in Maine that would be productive and interesting, why, I'd like to go home. So I got the idea. I called Mrs. Coffin, who was a town clerk in Ashland, Maine, and I said, look, if there's something I could do up that way that would be interesting, I'd kind of come home. And I said, but I don't expect anybody in Ashland remembers the Taverner boys or whatnot. We've been gone for so long. And she said, oh, my Lord, she says, remember you? Of course we remember you. Why, she says, your brother went in the ministry and set the church back 50 years, and you went on down to Washington and got involved in that Watergate thing, caused all that trouble down there. You're probably as two well-known, famous boys ever came out of this town. In fact, she says, they just put a sign in front of the house where you were born. I said, they didn't. She said, yes, they did. I said, what's that sign say? She says, Presque Isle, 20 miles. So I figured I was going back. It couldn't be Ashland, so I came back, but I'm afraid I'm not back in Ashland, at least not yet. But speaking of Washington and Maine and all, when I was in Washington, the nature of my work there used to get me invited to a lot of these Washington receptions that take place from 5 to 8 in the afternoon, and they have a lot of firewater and shrimp and things of that kind, and it's usually to some political purpose and whatnot. So I used to get invited to a lot of those things. But I was at one of them, and this rather large busted woman came up to me and said, Mr. Taverner, they tell me you're from the state of Maine. And I said, that's correct. I said, I am. And she said, well, they also said, someone said that you were born in a log cabin. And I said, no, that's not so. I said, but my father moved us into one just as soon as he could afford it. Now, I think that poor lady went off and believed it all. I mean, the way she walked away, you know, yeah. She probably didn't know the difference. You know, Maine, there's something about the story that I like the best, I guess, Kendall, of all the stories, although it may be known to a lot of people, because it is Maine. And that's the story of the fishing schooner. Now today, of course, commercial fishing is still a big thing in the state of Maine. It's a big, important industry, but it's very different than it was at the turn of the century.
Oh, yes.
You know, nowadays they go out in those 90-foot steel beam trawlers with all diesel power, refrigerated hulls, so they don't have to worry about the fish after they get the catch. And they have set of innerspring mattresses and pastel-colored cruise quarters and hi-fi record players and Coke machines and whatnot, and it's kind of like a cruise on the North Atlantic with a few fish thrown in.
Yeah.
But back at the turn of the century, it was quite different. They used these 90-foot or smaller Gloucester fishing schooners. These were two-masted schooners, depending on the wind only for propulsion, nothing that was mechanized. To refrigerate the hull, they cut ice in those inland lakes around Hope and Purgatory and Liberty and some of those towns, stored in the ice houses. Then they line the hull of the vessel with these ice chunks, and then take out with a hope of getting a good catch and getting back before the ice departed and the fish along with it. Now, as I say, their only propulsion was wind. They were dependent upon that. So they depended a lot on the seamanship of the skipper. It was in 1902 that there was a crusty old skipper from St. George, took his schooner off the Grand Banks. 4 days, he got a hull-down catch. She was lying mighty low in the water, with thousands and thousands of dollars worth of ground fish in that hole. Now, those are 1902 dollars, not the ones we know today. And the old skipper realized he'd better get back and get going, get the fish in before the ice melted. So he came about and headed back for Rockland, where he's going to discharge his fish and pay off the crew. About a day and a half offshore, the wind pooched. Now, I don't have any idea the folks in the Mattawamkeag know what happens when the wind pooches, but you do if you're down from the coastways.
Oh, yes.
Because when the wind pooches a day and a half off the coast of Maine, as Goebel says, there ain't nothing nowhere, any place, any harm. Just a dead, flat calm. And that vessel lay low in the water with all those tons of fish. The sails hung up, straight up and down like long drawers doing Worcester County in the wintertime. And there she was. Well, the old skipper, of course, proficiency in life was seamanship. So he tried everything he knew. He put a crew on the starboard side and ran them in unison the port side, tip her and heel her and get a little wind in the topsails, and that didn't work. He put a longboat out with a crew in it and tried to tow it off the lee of a nearby iceberg, pick a little wind up from that way. It didn't work. Tried to scull it with a rudder, that wouldn't go. She's too low in the water. So finally he turned to his second proficiency in life, which is profanity. Everything in the book and a lot of things he made up as he went along. He started striding the quarterdeck, that schooner, spitting tobacco and swearing and cursing. Now down below deck in the galley was a cook's helper. Very pious old man, a very religious old soul. And it bothered him terribly to hear all these profanity, whatnot, come down through the deck boards. So he put the pot over his head, and he put dish rags in his ears. He got under the galley, did everything to drown out that profanity, but as the Air Force says, it came through loud and clear. So finally he mustered his courage and went topside. And he faced the skipper on the quarterdeck, and he says, "Skipper, you're the finest seaman to ever go up on the coast of Maine. You know the ways of the sea and the ways of a vessel. If it was humanly possible for you to move this ship, we'd be docked in Rockland Harbor right now, discharging the fish and getting paid off. But it ain't humanly possible, and instead of calling on the only power that can help you, you stand here and call them bad names. Now, that don't make sense, Skipper. That don't make sense. You take the advice of an older man. He says, the thing for you to do is call on the Lord. Tell him your troubles. Make him a love offering to show your good intent. Tell him to ship you a little wind. You'll get your wind, Skipper. You'll get your wind." Well, the old skipper says, "Well, by God, I got nothing to lose. I sure tried everything else." He gets in his pocket, gets out a $50. He holds a $50 up, and he says, "Lord, if you're half as good as this guy says you are, ship me a little wind." And he pitched that coin overside. No sooner it hit the surface of the water, 110-mile-an-hour hurricane came up. Stripped her clean. Headsails went overside, bowsprit and foremast went, and she scudded for shore at 75 knots, which is a pretty good speed for a sailing vessel. She piled up on the beach down below South Thomaston, in what Durante would call a catastrophe. The old skipper came to below 6 feet of dead fish, worked his way up to get the sun, which he needed badly, and found himself staring square in the eyes of the old cook's helper, who was just as enthusiastic as he'd been offshore. "Skipper," he says, "you got your fish." He says, you got your wind, you got your wind." He said, "Didn't I tell you if you called on the Lord, made him a love offering, show your good intent, and ask him to ship your little wind, he'd answer your prayer? You got your wind, you got your wind, you got the fish, you got the wind." And the old skipper looked at him, he said, "Yes," he said, "but by God, if I'd known this damn wind was so cheap, I wouldn't have ordered so much." So I guess it wouldn't being that cheap. We probably better not try to carry on too long here during this visit.
Well, you mentioned how nice it is to be back in Maine. I haven't spent a lot of time outside Maine, just enough to know what it's like to be able to come back. And it makes me think of that old woman up country there. I forget her name now, but somebody was talking to her about going on vacations and running all over the countryside and flying around and all that. She says, "Well, as far as I'm concerned, when you're already there ain't much point in traveling." Well, that's the way I feel.
That's pretty good philosophy, I think.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm the proof of it, too. Because I'm back where I started and happy to be here. You know, staying over the salt water for a bit, there was this fellow down in Orange, New Jersey, who was a manufacturer. He wasn't a well-educated man, but he was a good businessman. He made himself quite a lot of money. In his middle years, he decided it was time to enjoy the money and also get a little status out of all this. So he got the impression that the thing to do would be to buy a boat, buy a yacht of some kind. So he found a 57-foot cruiser, which was a beauty. And he bought it. Didn't know anything about the sea, about boats or anything, but he struck out, decided he'd go up to Nova Scotia on a little sea trip. And so he went out of New York Harbor up through Long Island Sound, up through Narragansett Bay, up through the Cape Cod Canal into Casco Bay and on up toward Penobscot Bay, but put into Booth Bay Harbor. Went ashore and found an old coaster in there, and he said, you know, there's something wrong with this boat for which I paid a small fortune. Don't steer good. He says, doesn't handle right. The helm doesn't seem to do right. And he says, could you help me? And the fellow says, well, for a few dollars, I'll take a look. So he goes aboard and he looks her over and he says, well, he says, there's really nothing very wrong with this boat at all. She's a good vessel. Your problem is your compass isn't calibrated. He says, you calibrate that compass, you'll be all set. You'll handle good. You can be on your way and have a good time up Nova Scotia. And he says, well, how do you calibrate the compass? He says, well, he says, there's really not much to it if you know how. He says, for a few more dollars, I'll take you off the Rockland Navy trial runs up here, and we'll take some sightings on navigational aids and buoys and whatnot and calibrate that compass, and you can be on your way. So they struck out, and they got out there, and they were sighting on buoys and all this, and you know what happened down that area. No time at all, pea-soup fog dropped in. Right down, couldn't see the hand in front of their face, couldn't see a thing, and of course they cut the engine and laid there. Began to hear these horns and whistles all around them, which meant there were some vessels moving around. And by the temper of those horns, some of those vessels were 500 feet long. Mm-hmm. Well, the guy from Jersey, of course, lost his head right away. He said, my God, we're dead. Here we are in the water. Can't move, can't see where to go. Big vessels moving around out there. We're going to be crushed and swamped right here. We're dead right here in the water. The old fellow from Booth Bay said, now, wait a minute. He said, don't lose your cool. He said, we aren't either. He says, all we got to do is navigate by potatoes. He says, how do you navigate by potatoes? He says, well, you take a bag of potatoes and you go up in the bow and you throw them over one at a time. And when one don't splash, you turn. Now, I kind of use that a little bit in fooling around with some of the fellows in the legislature that I know.
Cheaper than radar, ain't it?
Well, I guess it is that. And, but I often sometimes accuse the legislative leadership down there in Augusta of operating, navigating by potatoes, too. When something don't go, they make a turn. So there may not be something to that. And mentioned in politics, Rogues Bluff, you know, up Machias Callis way.
Oh, yes.
There was a fellow up in Rogues Bluff a number of years ago now who...
Careful, I got relatives.
Yeah, well, it could be one of yours. You can tell after getting the story away. You can tell it's one of yours or not. But this fella had never been much of a success in life.
Yep.
He raked a few blueberries, you know, and he seined a few herring.
Yeah.
And he cut a little pulp, and I think maybe $1,100 was the best year he ever had. And as he got toward his 50s, well, he thought, geez, I'm not getting much out of all this. He says, I got to change. He says, what do they say in the cities? I got to reevaluate my occupational position. He says, get into something else. So he got to thinking, well, I guess there's two things I could do. He says, one, he says, I could run for the legislature. Or two, I could go on welfare. Now, they pay about the same, and some of the fellows say just about the same kind of amount of work in it. And he says, but I guess maybe I'd rather run for the legislature because it'd be a little more prestige for me. So he sent away to Sears and Roebuck down in Boston for a book on how to be a politician. Now, when that book came, it told him essentially this. It says, insofar as being a politician is concerned, there are two kinds of people. There are those who know you and those who don't know you. Now, those that know you, they either like you or they don't like you. If they like you, they're going to vote for you regardless. If they don't like you, there's nothing you can do to get them to vote for you, so don't waste your time on them. What you got to do is find out who doesn't know you and go after them and cultivate their vote and their interest. So he got in the town hall and got the town list there and wrote down the names of all the people in the outskirts that he didn't think knew him. Went around calling. Came to one farmhouse, knocked on the door. Farm wife answered the door, and he says, hello, he says, my name's Evan Jones. He says, and I'm running for legislature down in Augusta, and I'd sure appreciate your vote. She looked at him and says, Evan Jones, oh, I know you. Knew your father before him, your grandfather before him, and the whole posse are no damn good. I wouldn't vote for you if you were the last man in the state of Maine and them Russians were coming up the Penobscot River. I can't think of a thing I could do that would be a greater disservice to the people of Maine than send the likes of you down to Augusta to tell us how to live and spend our money. Now, you get the hell out of here. Don't you ever come to this yard again, because if you do, I'm going to put the dog on you. The fellow got out his little book with the names and whatnot, came down to her name, put a little check mark in front after he wrote doubtful. I think that's probably, Kendall, perhaps the philosophy of all politicians. Never say die.
Yeah.
Well, when I went up to Rustic there, as I mentioned, I went up in there, I went up old Route 2. You know, it goes up through Haynesville area and whatnot, instead of taking the interstate up. And I was reminded of back in the 50s, before they put that interstate in, there was a young lady from Holton who was going down to Bangor on a beautiful June morning. And she struck out from Holton down through Linneus, you know, and Haynesville and all that, in a beautiful convertible, whatnot, with the top down, and the sun was shining, and the birds were singing, and all was right with her world. And those days, that Route 2 was 45-mile-an-hour speed. Well, by the time she hit Linneus, which wasn't very far, she was doing 55 miles an hour. She looked in the rearview mirror, and there was a state trooper, one of those Maine state troopers with a blue light and all, right behind her. Fire siren going and light flashing and whatnot, so she stepped down a little harder on the accelerator. By the time she hit Haynesville, she was doing 65 miles an hour. Looked in the rearview mirror, and there were two state troopers behind her. The lights flashing and the sirens going. So she gunned it a little bit more. When she got down by Passamaquoddy, she was doing about 75 or 80 miles an hour. Looked in the rearview mirror, three state troopers right behind her. Lights flashing and the sirens going and all. So she hit Stillwater Corner. If you know Stillwater Corner, 90 degrees, she was doing 90 miles an hour. She made it, which was a miracle in itself. Down College Avenue in Orono, wheeled into the filling station there, Bill Gavitt run the chalet, reached to a stop, ran into the little room marked ladies. She was in there 3 or 4 minutes. When she came out here with these state troopers with their hands on their hips and their hats squared away, very displeased with her, went on, she smiled and says, "You fellas didn't think I was going to make it, did you?" Going back up to your old country again, up into Washington County, there was a family up in Washington County that was burned out. Mother and father and 8 children. And they lived in a kind of a tar paper shack to start with, and all they had was a little oil stove for heat and whatnot. And one February night, when it was about 28 below zero, the wind hit the stovepipe, tipped the stove over, and the place burned. Well, they got out of there with their lives, but nothing else. So they started, neighbors took them in and one thing and another. Now, the Baptist minister there decided it was his bounden duty to do something to help these people out. So he called a meeting in the Grange Hall, everybody in town to come, benefit for these people. And he had them all sit down front, the mother and the father and the 8 kids all in Pillsbury flour sacks, because that's all they had, sitting down front there. And the minister said, "I think we'd better open this meeting with prayer." And so he looked to heaven, he says, "Oh Lord, look with great compassion on these thy children in their time of destitution." And he said, "They've lived the life as thou would have them live it. They've read the book as thou would have them read it. They've done what thou would have them do, but in thy great wisdom thou hast seen fit to take away all their worldly goods. And they sit in front of you just as they came into this world with nothing. Oh Lord, send this family a barrel of sugar. Oh Lord, send this family a barrel of salt. Oh Lord, send this family a barrel of flour. Oh Lord, send this family a barrel of pepper. Oh God," he said, "that's too much pepper." so moderation in all things.
You got carried away. You know, you was talking about the trooper there, and the young lady outsmarted him. Reminded me of my great uncle Curt back home there. He told us one time that he'd been out hunting up Township 19 where they all go hunting. He says, "I come out of the woods there and come out into the road, and there was this black car sitting there with a fellow sitting in it. I didn't know who he was. And I went to pass him, and he stuck his head out the window, and he says to me, he says, 'How's the deer hunting?' And Uncle Curt, you know, he was a great one to brag. He never could tell the truth if a lie would suffice, you know. So he says, 'Oh,' he says, 'not bad at all. I killed 3 for breakfast.' Well, of course, as you know, in the state of Maine, you're only allowed 1 deer per season. So this fellow looked at him and he says, 'You know who I am?' Uncle Curt says, 'No, who are you?' He says, 'I'm the new game warden for Washington County.' Uncle Curt says, 'You know who I am?' The fellow says, 'No.' Curt says, 'I'm the biggest damn liar in the whole state of Maine.'
Good, very good.
The only time he ever told the truth.
Very good. Well, you know, speaking of stopping and seeing things, of course, people from away, as we call them, summer visitors and all, always have a lot of stories to tell about getting directions in Maine.
Oh, yes.
And there's more stories about getting directions in Maine. I think the one I liked the best was this Stouter Stater from Massachusetts was driving up, got up into Waterville when the old Elm Hotel was still there, and one of the local fellows was standing in front of the Elm Hotel, and this fellow wheeled up with his Massachusetts plates and said, "I'd like to go see Margaret Chase Smith's place in Skowhegan. Can you tell me how to get to Skowhegan?" Because there's nothing to it. He says, "All you do is turn right here," he says, "and go down this road here," he says, "until you come to Colby College, which you can't miss with all the big buildings. He says, bear right around Colby. He said, down by the barrens. He says, come up by the corn factory, out by the grove of pine trees. He says, a bear left there. He said, and make a switch where the old Baptist church used to be, and you're on your way.
Yeah.
Well, the fellow tried to remember all this, you see, so he was driving along, went down to Colby College, and he went to Barron's, and he went up by the corn factory and out by the trees and all this stuff. And 25 minutes later, he was right back where he started in front of the same guy. And boy, he was mad. So he yanked the window down. If I was going to hold it, he says, don't blow your stack. He says, I had to find out whether you could take directions or not. Now that I know how to take directions, I'll tell you how to get scouted. And I think that's probably one of the best of the many Maine direction stories.
You ever been up around Lincoln at all?
Yeah, I went up through there when I went up to Ashland there a while ago.
A friend of mine used to live up in that country. He was telling me that he and his uncle went out somewhere, and they got a box trailer full of cow manure to put on the garden. You talk about strange things happening. It even happens to Maine people, too. Among ourselves, we like to have a little fun with one another now and then. And they were coming down the road with this box trailer full of cow manure. And something happened. Either the hitch broke or it let go of something. Anyway, it flipped and the whole made an awful mess. And they're standing there looking around. By and by, this fella drove up in an old station wagon, rusted out clear to the windshield. They didn't know him. He didn't know them. But he got out and he looked it all over, never said a word. Took his jolly time looking it all over. Finally, he looked at him and he says, well, fellas, looks like your trailer's all right, but there ain't a hell of a lot left of that cow. And away he went.
That reminds me of another one somewhat along the same vein. A few years ago, well, let's say several years ago, Maine had a governor who was not too popular.
Really?
And we won't name him, but he wasn't too popular. And there was this guy up in, I don't know if you know the Lincoln County, Kennebec County area, but Whitefield and Windsor. Well, this fella had lived in Windsor, but he had a farm down there in Whitefield. And he'd been planning all for a long while to fertilize his field down there, a 40-acre field down there. He's going to fertilize it, but he kept postponing it, kept postponing it, kept postponing it. So finally, one morning, it was bright and sunny, so he loaded up his truck with this cow manure, or horse manure, actually, what it was, the horse manure that he had, and he loaded up the truck and struck out for Windsor to fertilize the field. As he started down the road, he noticed the clouds begin to form. Oh, my Lord, it's going to rain, and if it rains with this load I got on here, he said it's going to be a mess. So he gunned her up some and got her up about 60, 65 miles an hour. Well, Maine State Trooper, whom he knew, Bill Bailey, actually, he knew him. The trooper pulled behind him, pulled him over, said, Mr. Jones, he says, where you going, that kind of speed? Well, I can get down and fertilize my acreage down there, he says, and it looked like rain, so I kind of was moving along. He said, you were moving along, all right? He said, I clocked you at 67 miles an hour, this 45-mile-an-hour road. He said, that old truck isn't supposed to go that fast anyway. He said, you got a governor on that truck? He says, hell no, that's horse manure you smell. So that's, I guess, probably, we won't try to guess which governor that might have been.
Well, that could fit a number of ones in the last 50 years or so.
I suppose to become plenty that could qualify in there. The staying again, as long as we're in that kind of a agricultural situation, Knox County, the state prison located. The Warren area, there was this farmer there that was going out to do his fertilizing, and he had a load of manure on his truck. And he looked like it was going to rain, so he said to his hired man, Joe, he says, why don't you climb up on top of that load of manure, and I'll put a top over you so you can stay dry, because you sit up here with me, you're going to get wet, open truck. He said, you're a good man, I like to take care of you, you've been good to me. And so Joe, the hired man, climbed up on the load of manure, and he put a top over him, and off they went down the road. Well, as it so happened, there was an inmate escaped from the state prison, Thomaston, near there. So they got one place, and there was a roadblock of prison guards. And they stopped, and he says, where you going, Mr. Jones? Well, I'm going down here, he says, Warren, and fertilize my field. And he says, well, what do you got in the back of the truck? He said, just a load of manure and my hired man. I said, okay, go ahead. Go down further, and here's another roadblock with the 3 or 4 state troopers. Stopped him, and he says, where are you going, sir? And he said, well, I'm going down into Warren and fertilize my field. He said, what do you got in the back of that truck? And he said, I got a load of manure and my hired man. Goes on further, stopped for the 3rd time. Same thing. What's in the back of the truck? He said, a load of manure and my hired man. So they go on further, you know, and whatnot, and the farmer began to sing, and the sun came back out and whatnot, and he said, Joe, he says, you're a good man. He says, how you doing back there? And he says, good, fine, fine, Farmer Jones, fine. Farmer Jones said, anything I can do for you, Joe? He said, well, there is one thing. He said, what's that? He said, next time, how about introducing me first? Try and get a perspective on the situation. I was reminded of the, speaking of traveling around, the traveling salesman, and this isn't a traveling salesman story, but there's a traveling salesman who was driving up through Franklin County and up by Strong somewheres in the open country. A cat ran out of a farmyard across the road, and he hit him and killed him. So he felt very bad about it, of course, and being a very responsible kind of guy, he went up and knocked on the farm door, and the woman came to the door, and he said, you have a black and white cat? And she said, yes. He said, well, I'm awful sorry. He said, but he said, accident. He said, I'm awful sorry, but I just ran over it and killed it. And he said, I'd kind of like to replace it. She said, well, come right in. You can start in the cupboard. He says, there's a mouse in the cupboard.
You know, you were talking about farm animals and one thing and another, and bad weather. You know, people in Maine, rural Maine, to some degree, I think, they have something in common with the Scots people.
Yes, I do.
When you get a good day in Scotland, you know, it's quite rare, and it's the same thing around here. And you get to where you get suspicious after a while. Like they tell about the old Scotsman that was walking down the street in Glasgow. He met a young fella that was feeling pretty good, and the young fella says to him, he says, good morning, Jock. Says, it's a beautiful day, ain't it? And the old fella says, aye, it is, but we'll pay for it. It's kind of like that in Maine, you know.
Right,
there was an old fellow that was out plowing a field with a prize breeding bull. And his neighbor come along, and he looked at him, and a minute then he thought he'd gone crazy. So he called him over to the fence, and he says, John, he says, what the hell are you doing using that prize bull to plow the field with? And the old fellow says, well, there's nothing wrong with my tractor, you know. I could have been using that, but I had a purpose in mind plowing with that bull. I just wanted the old son of a bitch to find out that life ain't all fun and games. How about hotting up your tea?
Yeah, that would be good. We could just trick that a little bit. That would be just great.
Well, you got to admit that an evening with Don Taverner sure beats watching flies die. Come to think of it, it beats the hell out of splitting wood, too.